Labor only wins when we are the party of the future. As you're aware, many of our sister parties overseas have failed to adapt to the changing political conditions. They've turned inwards and looked backwards. We can't make the same mistake. We must look forward and we must renew. Labor must always be a progressive party of modernisation, of aspiration, of growth, of jobs. We're the party of social justice, the party of nation building, the party of our natural environment, the party of science and the party of the future. Our movement was founded at a time when your destiny was anchored to your class. Labor's historic mission has been to sever that anchor chain. No one held back and no one left behind. Implementing that vision starts with a renewal of Australia's democracy. And when I announced the third vision statement would be on democracy, little did I know that democracy would be under attack, as it was this week. Now in its 7th year, the government has got to the point where it won't support freedom of the press. It won't support the freedom to protest. It won't support freedom of association through the trade union movement. And now it won't even support debate in Australia's national parliament. When we tried to do our job as an opposition this week and hold ministers to account for their conduct, the default position of this reactionary government was to shut down debate and gag us, which they did on more than 30 occasions in just 2 weeks. On Thursday, they pushed their anti-union legislation through the House of Representatives without a single word of debate, not one word. This unprecedented action was reminiscent of an authoritarian one-party state, not a modern democracy. For the Morrison government, democracy is an inconvenience. We will contrast this with plans not just to defend democracy, but to enrich it. Labor will have to formulate our plans for Australia against a backdrop of unparalleled economic, social, geopolitical and environmental change. We can approach this task in one of 2 ways. We can ignore inconvenient truths, shout cultural insults louder and louder at each other, or we can have a proper, grown-up, democratic conversation about the best way forward for our country. Coping with the future is going to require difficult choices. To succeed, broad interests, concerns and ideas must be heard. We must examine things as they are rather than as we want them to be. Expert knowledge must be treated with respect. Let's talk to each other with level heads, with reason, not anger, with respect, not condescension. And let's take a step back from the social media precipice. Think before we tweet. Take some heat out of our debates. Passion is good. Trolling is bad. In short, we can't start building a better future for Australia without renewing our democracy. So here are 5 priorities for strengthening our democracy that will allow us to deal with the challenges of today and build a better tomorrow together. First, I want to rebuild our capacity to have constructive national conversations about the big issues. Democracy requires more than just the right constitutional and legislative arrangements in order to work effectively. The starting point, of course, is inclusion. Without it, our democratic institutions can become little more than a forum for combat rather than cooperation. It's obvious to everyone that the necessary degree of respect is currently absent, and we, of course, were reminded of that this week. The prime culprit is the culture war. It undermines the potential for rational discussion. The monotonous pattern of culture war arguments is now well established. If you disagree with someone, your facts are fake, your character is questioned, and you're denounced as part of an elite. On the other side of the coin, if you're not progressive enough, you're cancelled. The debate over climate change is the most obvious example. It seems that no amount of international scientific consensus or, indeed, tragic experience will convince certain members of the coalition that climate change is a real and present danger. Australians can now see, smell and feel, literally, the changing climate. But our government thinks they're only imagining it. Coalition members too often see climate change as little more than a conspiracy cooked up by academic scientists to get research grants and by environmental activists to destroy the free market. People are subject to attack for simply putting their views, even if they're only 16 years old. I recently heard David Attenborough's right to speak about the destruction of the world's endangered species questioned because he flies the world to make his documentaries. Seriously. Questioning people's motives has now gotten so ridiculous that some of Australia's most experienced firefighters couldn't even get the ear of their own government to warn of the dangers of this year's fire season just because they accepted the reality of climate change. Time and again they tried. Time and again they were ignored. Even firefighters are now denounced as cultural elites. This has got to stop. In a world that's being revolutionised by science and technology and threatened by a changing climate, what sort of country treats its scientists, educators and firefighters like they're enemies of the people? The answer is one that will have fewer jobs, a lower standard of living and a more dangerous environment in the decades to come. On the other side of the argument, I think those of us who advocate change need to understand the viewpoints of those who will feel insecure by that change. We must consider their point of view, their interests, their security, their future, their solutions. The convoy into Clermont was not helpful. We can't afford to let culture wars dominate our politics and our discussions like this. As Leader of the House in a minority parliament, I saw firsthand how it was possible to respect and work with your opponents. You can hear other people's point of view without necessarily compromising your own. I believe the country only advances when people engage with each other in meaningful ways. The big economic reforms of the 80s, the gun law reform of the 90s, the NDIS a decade later. These national achievements required leadership, but they succeeded because of agreement. If one of the distinguishing characteristics of being on the left of the political spectrum is a faith in humanity, there's an obligation to engage as broadly as possible. I do have faith in humanity, not just an abstract humanity, but everyday Australians, including those whose views differ from mine. And I have faith we can find a better way, one that lets our democratic processes work as a source of progress, one that allows our democracy to be at its best. The second thing we can do to get our democracy working as it should is to break down our echo chambers. What we need is a little less anger and a little less outrage. We could also do with a little less volume. The internet has facilitated much greater participation in politics and certainly can be seen as a democratic force. Social media means that every news consumer can also today be a news producer. But because algorithms, aided by artificial intelligence, encourage people to follow sources and publishers that largely reinforce and entrench their existing views, we've seen a much bigger polarisation of political discourse. Have a think about where global politics is at today. This is a global phenomenon that we have to deal with and a challenge for us. I must say, the phrase, everyone thinks that, is more and more common because more and more people have never met anyone who disagrees with their entrenched view. It is becoming a more prominent feature of political debate today than when I was elected at the turn of the century. It's like we're characters in the movie Spinal Tap, where the amp goes all the way up to 11. But when progressives retreat into our comfort zones, we cede the ground that we should be claiming. Genuine political discourse and problem solving is discouraged. Alternative views are not just dismissed, they're not even considered. One of the consequences of the increased polarisation of politics is that compromise and searching for outcomes are seen as weakness. I argue we need to talk with people who disagree with us, engage, debate, advance. We need to argue our case, every forum, every opportunity. Because politics in an echo chamber does nothing to advance a progressive agenda. If you have confidence in your ideas and policies, there's nothing to fear from debating them. Sadly, echo chambers aren't just reinforced by algorithms deciding what we see. Sometimes online platforms are unwilling to filter out content proven to be misinformation. They'll argue that it doesn't violate their so-called community guidelines. They say that so long as they eventually note the information as fake, the community can judge for itself.